Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of this hour. US President Donald Trump has said he hopes to reach a deal with Iran despite warnings from the country's supreme leader that any US attack would spark a wider regional war. US President Donald Trump has said he believes Washington can reach a deal with Cuba even as his administration ramps up pressure through tariffs and oil supply restrictions targeting the India's island's allies. A Russian drone hit a bus of Ukrainian miners, killing 12 people and struck a maternity hospital, injuring patients as attacks resumed amid fragile peace talks and a disputed pause on energy strikes. A 5-year-old boy and his father have returned to Minnesota after being released from ICE detention in Texas, drawing a community welcome as local officials voiced concerns over continued immigration enforcement in the area. Egypt's president and Jordan's king have reaffirmed opposition to displacing Palestinians, as Israel said the Rafah crossing with Egypt would partially reopen on Monday to allow limited movement of people from Gaza. Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi has reaffirmed his call for inclusive national dialogue, but set strict conditions as fighting continues in eastern DR Congo against M23 rebels, stressing that any talks must take place inside of the country under institutional control and must not challenge his electoral legitimacy or court rulings. According to statements published by UNICEF and the Republic of Finland have announced 2.7 million euros in funding to support Syrian children through inclusive education, child protection and social protection services, targeting the most vulnerable, including children with disabilities and those affected by the conflict and displacement. Officials began tallying votes after polls closed in Costa Rica's presidential election, with ruling party candidate Laura Fernandez the clear favorite amid concerns over rising crime and political stability. Now for this hour, we start with UK. Former British Minister Peter Mandelson has resigned from the Labour Party following new revelations about his connections to financier Jeffrey Epstein. The resignation follows the release of documents by the U.S. Department of Justice, which suggest Epstein made financial payments to Mandelson in 2003 and 2004. Mandelson has denied the claims, pledging to investigate, but stated that he did not want to cause further embarrassment to the party. Mandelson, a key figure in Labour's success under Tony Blair, had already been dismissed as the UK's ambassador to the US in 2025 due to his Epstein links. In related news, a massive release of Epstein files also included controversial photographs and emails involving Prince Andrew. The files revealed images of Andrew with an unidentified women and emails showing continued contact with Epstein after his 2008 conviction. Following the release, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has urged Prince Andrew to testify before the U.S. Congress. The scandal led to King Charles III stripping Prince Andrew of his royal titles in 2025. Now for this, we welcome former Ambassador KP Fabian. He's a former diplomat, joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us. Welcome to NewsX World. Now, as we continue to see a lot of political elites, their connections to Jeffrey Epstein comes out, how do you think this is changing the image that people have, the trust, the transparency that people used to have or still have on, political elites? And what more can we expect from this release of the latest release?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the important points is that the Department of Justice has not released the in full, the Epstein file. Has done what it claims redaction for the sake of protecting the identity of the victims. But my suspicion is, and I could be wrong, my suspicion is that the redaction has been made primarily to protect Trump. So that is point number one. Point number two is that what has now happened is that there is so much focus on Prince Andrew or former Prince Andrew, and also, as you mentioned, on Lord Mandelson, former UK ambassador to the United States. Now, the key question is not whether Bill Gates did something, not whether Clinton did something. The key question is, what is the involvement of President Donald Trump? Because he is in power, others are not in power. Now, I'm afraid that sort of focus is still not there in the media or elsewhere. Now, it is possible that the Department of Justice will be compelled by the House, the Congress, to come out with more revelations, and it is possible that such revelations might have implications for President Trump's popular standing.
Thank you for highlighting that. And as we know that President Donald Trump, yes, President Trump is of course under a lot of pressure for the release, but it seems like they have already passed the deadline, and then on top of that, this is a very slow, gradual release. So how do you think is this a tactic by the Trump administration to elongate this? What do you think this is the strategy behind this gradual release?
Well, the Trump administration strategy is to focus attention on other, what shall we say, actors or leaders, and thereby defocus attention on President Trump himself. And to an extent, it has succeeded because, by till now, the vast majority of Republicans do not seem to be concerned. But nevertheless, in the MAGA movement, there is a very conservative, Christian conservative, monogamous wing, and they have started getting concerned. So as I said, it might, I repeat the word might, affect President Trump, but it has not yet seriously affected his popularity.
Right. And like you mentioned, there's so many things in President Trump's table right now, including the domestic things with ICE and Jeffrey Epstein and so many more. So how do you think President Trump will move to gain back some popularity that he has been losing recently?
Well, President Trump is capable of course correction when he is facing disaster. As we know, in the case of Greenland, he sort of walked back from military action. Then he walked back from imposition of tariffs on the 8 countries when European Union made it clear that they were going to hit back with what they call a bazooka. That is $107 billion worth of US exports to European Union would have been jeopardized. So then he walked back. Now, in the case of Mississippi, Minnesota, Mississippi, this ice business, he again walked back for a while. Then he again, sort of reversed it. So, he is capable of it, but to what extent he is, what shall I say, connected with the reality, because he is surrounded by people, it's like like a court, you know what I mean, of the king, where you don't tell the king anything which he doesn't like to hear. So that is there. And don't forget that President Trump is more or less completely isolated from professional bureaucracy, whether in the Department of State or elsewhere. He depends on his trusted appointees who do not always have the necessary competence. So there is a problem, and I do not think that the real estate tycoon in President Trump has realized that, recognized that problem in full measure.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fabian, for highlighting that. Please stay with us. Now we move on to our next news. U.S. President Donald Trump has said that he is hopeful of reaching a deal with Iran despite strong warnings from Tehran. Speaking at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida, Trump has responded after Iran's supreme leader cautioned that any U.S. attack would trigger a regional war. However, Trump had played it down the warnings, pointing to the strong U.S. naval presence in the region. Meanwhile, he has indicated that talks with Iran appear close, saying the coming days could be critical regardless. Trump has added that if no deal is reached, the situation would test Iran's warnings of wider conflict. Let's listen into what the U.S. president has shared.
Sir, on Iran, the Supreme Leader today said that U.S. attack could spark a regional war. Do you have any response to that, sir?
Why wouldn't he say that? Of course you're going to say that, but we have the biggest, most powerful ships in the world over there, very close, a couple of days, and hopefully we'll make a deal. If we don't make a deal, then we'll find out whether or not he was right.
Now we welcome back former Ambassador KP Fabian for our discussion on Iran and US. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for staying with us. Now, although Iran is saying that, it's always open to negotiations, but they insist that there are nuclear facilities for peaceful civilian purposes and they will not budge on that. And some sticking points still exist, as US also says while they are open to talks, it seems like they also have some negotiating points that they're not willing to budge. So how do you think this will be forcing these two parties to, what cards do these parties have to play in terms of diplomacy here? Do you see it even happening?
Well, there is a chance that diplomacy might be able to prevent a war, but I wanted to emphasize a point which most media commentators have missed out. It was President Trump who in 2018 walked out of the Iran nuclear deal, agreed to under President Obama. And as we all know, under that deal, Iran's nuclear activities were fully open to IAEA inspection. It follows that the Obama deal made sure that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. Now, for his own reasons, and let me explain that, at some point of time, when President Trump was contesting for his first term, he came to the conclusion that he was not going to make it, and he thought of withdrawing. And then a man called Steve Bannon came to him and said, listen, I've got a winning formula for you, and that includes maligning the Obama deal. Then we will get strong support from the Jewish lobby and all that, and also from other Americans. So that is why the candidate Trump started attacking the Obama deal. He didn't do it right at the beginning of his campaign, later. I said, so that is the story. And it is Trump who is responsible for the economic collapse of Iran by reimposing sanctions in 2018. And it is because he reimposed sanctions that Iranian currency has gone down. Iran, there is shortage of employment and all that. And what started was an economic, economic grievances. But later, of course, partly it turned into a demand for the fall of the Ayatollah regime. But there again, once Trump threatened to attack, many Iranians who were protesting had second thoughts because they didn't want to be, quote, liberated, unquote, by Trump. Now Trump is threatening. What for? After all, let Iran have its nuclear program so long as IAEA makes sure through inspections that it is not making the nuclear bomb. That is sensible. But I do not know why, but probably support Netanyahu, who has difficulties of his own. Trump wants to escalate the situation, but he has been warned by his Gulf allies that he cannot use their airspace or their terrain for attacking Iran. So my guess is that Trump will settle for a negotiated settlement, and Iranians, being good chess players, they will also play the game in a way that avoids a war. But I could be wrong.
Thank you for sharing that. And Ambassador, lastly, thank you for bringing up this Iran nuclear deal that U.S. walked out in the first place to our conversation. So do you think this has creeped up onto Trump now in his second term? Do you think Trump continues to underestimate Iran?
Possible. It's not a question of, what shall I say? Trump's strategy is to threaten the other side and force the other side to come to the negotiating table and make it surrender. But that may or may not work in the case of Iran. But he will try.
Right. With that, I would like to thank Ambassador KP Fabian for joining us today and sharing that insight. Thank you very much. Now we move on to U.S. and Cuba. The United States says it has begun talks with Cuba's leadership as President Donald Trump pushes for a deal days after threatening Cuba's fragile economy with what he described as a virtual oil blockade. Trump has called Cuba a failing nation without Venezuela's support and said negotiations are underway, though he gave no details on what a deal might include. Washington's pressure has intensified since the U.S. operation ousted Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, cutting off a major source of oil for Havana and exacerbating fuel shortages. Trump has signed orders threatening tariffs on countries that sell oil to Cuba, a move Havana says is aimed at suffocating its economy. Mexico says it plans to send humanitarian aid, including food and supplies, even as diplomatic efforts continue over oil shipments. Cuba has accused the U.S. of economic coercion as fuel lines grow and power cuts deepen across the island. Let's listen into what the U.S. President Donald Trump has shared.
Well, Cuba's a failing nation. It has been for a long time, but now it doesn't have Venezuela to prop it up. So we're talking to the people from Cuba, the highest people in Cuba. We'll see what happens. I want the people that came here that were horribly treated by Cuba to be taken care of, to be able to go back and do what they have to do. They have their family there. They haven't been able to see them in years, many, many years. So I think we're going to make a deal with Cuba.
President Trump, back to Texas.
It's in bad shape. Cuba's in bad shape. Cuba has a humanitarian problem.
Now for this, we welcome Ms. Mitali Nikore. She's an economist, joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much, Ms. Nikore, for joining us again. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Now looking at this, can you give us a little bit of background on how Cuba, why is President Trump linking Cuba with Venezuela and saying that Cuba was dependent on it?
So I I think, first of all, thank you so much for having me in this discussion. I think what is quite evident is that for several years, there was a partnership between Venezuela and Cuba, and Venezuela was the main oil supplier for Cuba, and Venezuela was literally sending discounted, we can say, oil supplies to Cuba to keep their economy running. And this is an undisputed fact. However, some of the allegations that the president has made that Cuba is a failing economy, or that there is a humanitarian crisis there. This humanitarian crisis is recent, because since the president sort of went in and took over control of Venezuelan oil production, that's when the humanitarian crisis actually started.
Short-term and medium-term impacts of this oil blockade on Cuba?
So, immediate-term impacts are already visible. We can see that people are in distress. There are long queues at fuel stations where people are unable to get, fuel, and life has come almost to a grinding halt. We see 20-hour power cuts. I think the only situation we can compare this to is the Sri Lankan economic crisis, which happened, 2 years ago, when people were absolutely without fuel and power. These are basic requirements for life, and the fact that these have been cut off without alternate supplies being negotiated puts Cuba in a very difficult position. Also, it's very difficult for other countries to help Cuba beyond humanitarian aid. I mean, humanitarian aid is not something that can be frowned upon, but honestly, like, economic deals with Cuba at this point in time for other Latin American countries also are quite a difficult scenario, because they then risk irking the United States, which basically wants to do a deal with Cuba in the way that it wants, and therefore puts Cuba, as well as anybody else wanting to support Cuba, in a difficult situation.
Thank you for sharing that. And now, from an economic standpoint, does this intensified pressure from Washington improve Washington's negotiating leverage with Taiwan, or does it risk deepening structural damage?
See, the issue is, I would say it's both. A country like the US is sort of showing us that it can simply just get what it wants at any time without any prior notice. It can literally go into a country where it wants to grab, the oil assets and simply abduct their president. I mean, nobody is denying that the president of Venezuela was a dictator. But at the same time, the fact that actions were taken by the U.S. of this kind are questionable under international law. At least with Cuba, there are negotiations, but these negotiations are also done in such a way that Cuba really doesn't have many options at this stage. It either does business with the United States in the terms offered by the United States, or risks, becoming a failed state. So honestly, in this situation, not really very many options for Cuba at the moment.
With that, I would like to thank Ms. Nikore for joining us today and sharing that insight with us. Now we move on to Turkey. A tragedy has struck in Antalya, Turkey, when a passenger bus overturned, killing at least 9 people and injuring 26 others. The bus was traveling from Tekirdağ to Antalya in rainy and foggy conditions, with 34 passengers on board. Emergency crews rushed to the scene, treating the injured and carrying victims on stretchers. Drone footage shows the bus lying on its side in a roadside ditch as rescue teams continue recovery operations. Antalya Governor Hulusi Sahin has said a technical investigation is underway, noting the bus may have entered an intersection too quickly in wet conditions. Now we move on to our tech news. Elon Musk's social media platform X has experienced a brief outage, affecting more than 19,000 US users. The outage has lasted approximately 45 minutes, with service largely restored by 12:04 p.m. ET. X did not immediately respond to a request for comment regarding the cause of the disruption. However, down detect or tracks outages by compiling status reports from users, and the actual number of affected users may vary. The platform is now back online, and users have reported no further issues at this time. That's all we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.